Neurips 2024, Part 3. This paper's titled Learning to Assist Humans Without Inferring Rewards. It's a paper out of Berkeley, and the idea is to use empowerment as a guiding function for an agent to be assisting humans. So what does that mean? Let me parse that out a little bit. So when agents deal with humans, we have a fundamental problem, which is that we don't know the reward function of the human. In other words, how do we assist a human without knowing what the human actually wants to do? Now, this is a deeper problem than one might think, because often the human themselves doesn't know exactly what they want to do. So there are two ways to do this in AI. One is inverse reinforcement learning. Inverse reinforcement learning is basically the task of watching the human behavior and inverting or deducting a reward function from the human. So this would be, for example, Netflix recommending movies to you by watching what you're watching. So this is pretty old. Ever since collaborative filtering, we've had attempts of inverse reinforcement learning. Now, of course, you could imagine, let's say, an elderly assistive robot that is assisting patients with Alzheimer's. So they can't communicate with them. We don't know exactly what they want. So we watch their behavior and we find out their reward functions. Reward function is a fancy word for, we found out what is optimal for them, what works for them. And then we maximize that reward function, which can be trained by reinforcement learning. So the other is empowerment. That's a measure of an agent's ability to influence the environment. Now, this paper talks about that. And the idea is to find a structured way, an algorithmic way, to have an agent change the environment such that the human can act and has a better likelihood of outcomes. In other words, how can we change the environment without knowing what the human actually wants, but still improve the human's action space? So this is the problem setting here. The problem setting is we want to be able to have an assistant AI, whether it's a robot or a textual AI, that is helping changing the environment. So let me give a concrete example. So for example, in the paper, we're talking about a very simple game. Imagine a chessboard, and imagine you're on one field of the chessboard, and you can move from that field to another, let's say, field, which is your goal, and there's obstacles. And you know, each time step you can make a move. And an agent can move the obstacles around. And the goal is now, what can the agent do to improve your chances to go from where you are towards your goal, without knowing what your reward function is? So now the agent knows that you want to get to, let's say, G7, which is the field that your goal. The agent knows that. But the agent doesn't know what your reward function is. In other words, it's not clear whether you want to be more efficient, whether you want to maybe go around something, whether you want to be fast, whether you want to be safe, none of that stuff. So the agent doesn't know your policy. That's the key. So we don't know the policy. And the reason this is a problem, and I think Sergey and all worked on this, is because in the robotics, particularly in the agentic robotics space, the idea of knowing somebody's reward function is a pretty big assumption. It's a pretty big assumption because we often don't know it, and also it's difficult to do the inverse reinforcement learning because people's actions aren't always very clear. The idea behind empowerment is to think about the changes that an agent can affect on a world, and an agent is more empowered if it can affect a large degree of change over future outcomes. So you have a human and you want to empower the human by giving the human more potential outcomes that the human then can choose from. We don't know what's beneficial. Let's be clear about this. So now, it depends on several factors: the environment dynamics, the choice of future actions, the current state, and other agents in the environment. It talks about one human and one robot and an environment that the robot can influence. It's a simple problem, and you can see that, of course, we can increase the complexity here quite dramatically, but that's not the point here. The definition of empowerment is an agent is more empowered if it can affect a large degree of change over future outcomes. This is what empowerment means. And the question, of course, is how does one measure that? And the measurement, the technical term is mutual information, but let me go back a little bit and talk about empowerment via successor representation. The empowerment via successor representation, the idea that you have first successor representation is, think about it this way. It's a map of today's state and all possible future states that a human can have. Mutual information is the overlap between the state of the human, the map of its future states, and the states that the agent has today and that it can affect. So there's an overlap, and you want to increase the empowerment means just that an action today by the agent increases the possible states of the human in the future. So this is fundamentally what it means. It's a very crude way to deal with this because, again, we don't know the reward function. If we knew the reward function, we wouldn't have to use all possible states, and we wouldn't necessarily have to make the assumption that the human wants to have more options in the future, right? Because that's already one of the big caveats of this approach is maybe we don't want to increase the optionality, maybe we want to constrain the human. Sometimes constraining the human is actually better because then she or he gets much faster to reach a goal. But we're not there. We're not there in this particular case. Contrastive representations learn to model mutual information between the current state, action, and future states, which we then use to compute the empowerment objective. So contrastive representation learns to model the mutual information. The mutual information is the overlap between the states of the agent and the states of the human and the future states of the human with the states of the agent and the future states of the agent. So think of it like two maps of possible actions and overlaps between those actions. And the more they overlap, the more empowerment we have. This is in a nutshell how empowerment is defined. And now, and again, every time we look at unsupervised representation learning and RL, we always try to do the same thing. When we do unsupervised learning, first we want to understand the world. We want to understand all the possible outcomes that the human can have, that the agent can have, and then the mutual information is all the actions that the agent can do which affect the human, right? This is what the empowerment is. And now the RL is going to optimize. In other words, it's going to find the most optimal trajectory by which we influence the environment such that the human space is enlarged. So we don't do all possible actions. We only do those actions that actually improve the human's state space. So again, to summarize, I guess this is really important. There's two aspects here, right? There's representation learning, which is an unsupervised way to understand what is the state space of the human and what is the state space of the agent, and then how do these overlap? That's the mutual information. That's also a way to measure empowerment, because let's say we have zero overlaps. It means whatever you do, the human action today and future actions and states are completely irrelevant. Then you have no empowerment, i.e., my action today has almost no influence on what Donald Trump's going to do tomorrow. But my action today might have a large influence on what my son will do tomorrow, and in a month, and in a year, and maybe not in 10 years. Now, if I want to have an influence on my son in 10 years, I better think really hard about the action today. So, for example, I can buy him a book, the biography of Richard Feynman. You've got to be kidding me, Mr. Feynman. Maybe that book will have an influence on my son 10 years down the road. But maybe today, by paying for tuition for him to go to Stanford, that's going to have a large impact on his action space in the next 2 to 4 to 5 to 6 years. So in that sense, again, empowerment is measured by mutual information. What can I do to influence the human's action and state space? The reinforcement learning part is when we try to optimize this state space. So that is the question, okay, now I know I can influence my son's behavior, but what do I do? How do I do it more efficiently? How do I increase the likelihood of success? And again, the problem is, of course, I don't know exactly what success means. I don't know what the human wants. I don't have a reward function, but what I have is I have its action space. And the goal is to increase the action space. So I would say that this paper is, I would call it more of an experimental paper. It's really a rudimentary approach towards a more fundamental problem, which is empowerment, and more generally understanding how to assist humans with AI without knowing their reward function. And the solution is to find an iterative way to, the solution is twofold. One is to map the state space, action space, and future state space of the human and the agent, find the overlaps, and then use reinforcement learning to find the optimal trajectory of the mutual action spaces and state spaces so that we have the best possible outcomes. Now, best possible outcome in this very simple model means more options for the human. So all the actions that the agent can make that increase the action space of the humans are good actions. And those are the ones that the RL model will provide. Thank you.